The story begins not with a coronation or a battlefield, but with silence. It is the silence of a kingdom holding its breath, as if the air itself remembers something it dares not speak aloud. In the chronicles of forgotten Europe, or perhaps only in the whispered folklore of its borderlands, there exists a tale of a prince unlike any other. His name, preserved only in fragments, has been erased by time and politics, but his legend endures. He was not remembered for victories, for laws, nor for dynasties continued. He was remembered for one thing alone. He spoke only to the dead. Imagine the setting: a castle rising from the mist, its towers sharp against the pale moon. Torches line the ramparts, their flames small and defiant against the immensity of night. Within its stone walls, nobles conduct their rituals of power, banquets, councils, marriages arranged and betrayed. Yet behind all this grandeur, in chambers where the light never quite reaches, rumors bloom like mold in the damp corners. Servants whisper of the young heir who refuses to answer his tutors, who turns away from his mother's lullabies, who does not respond to the laughter of other children. Instead, he listens, intently, silently, to voices no one else can hear. The story comes to us fractured. Some claim it was during the twilight of the medieval era, when kingdoms were stitched together with fragile alliances and torn apart by wars of faith. Others insist it was later, during the Renaissance, when superstition still shadowed the triumph of reason. No historian can agree, because the records themselves are inconsistent. Official archives omit the boy entirely, while folk ballads and forbidden manuscripts center him as the cursed axis of his family's downfall. It is as though the kingdom tried to erase him from its memory, and in doing so, ensured his ghost would never fade. From the very beginning, the atmosphere surrounding his birth was heavy with signs. The midwives later confessed, quietly, when pressed by the clergy, that the night was marked by an unnatural stillness. Dogs did not bark. Owls did not cry. The wind itself seemed to halt. One chronicler, writing decades later, claimed that the moon was obscured by a halo of blood-red haze. Whether these were embellishments or genuine memories, we cannot know. What is certain is that the boy entered the world with eyes that unnerved everyone who looked upon him. Wide, unblinking, and oddly calm, as if he were already listening to something beyond the chamber. The kingdom's court was not immune to superstition. In this age, omens were read into every birth, every illness, every sudden death. Monarchies thrived on divine legitimacy, and the slightest hint of a curse could sway political alliances. Thus, the prince's strange silence quickly became more than a private family matter. It became a public question of fate. Was this child a blessing, a prophet sent to guide them? Or was he a curse, a herald of ruin? The corridors of power filled with uneasy speculation. Ambassadors sent back cryptic reports. The heir does not speak, yet he listens as though attended by many. The clergy dispatched exorcists, thinly veiled as confessors. Physicians poked and prodded, diagnosing ailments of the tongue, the throat, the humors. None could explain his refusal to utter a single word to the living. And so, silence settled like a second crown upon his head. The boy was educated. Of course, tutors brought him books, taught him letters, pressed quills into his small hands. He read, he wrote, he observed. But when asked to speak, he only lowered his gaze, lips sealed. At first, the court assumed muteness. Yet late at night, servants reported hearing his voice. Faint, hushed, not like a child's playful babble, but like solemn conversation. When they entered his chambers, the boy was always alone, always facing a dark corner, or the shadow beneath a chair, or the cold emptiness of the hearth. From here, the legend takes on its chilling character, because those who claim to have overheard him insist that his words did not belong to a child. He spoke names long forgotten, titles of courtiers long buried, grievances centuries old. He spoke of drowned soldiers whose bones rested in riverbeds, of peasants who perished unnamed during famines. He spoke as though surrounded by a court not of flesh and blood, but of phantoms. The castle itself seemed to change around him. Where once its halls resounded with the laughter of feasts, now whispers clung to the stone. Tapestries were said to twitch as if stirred by invisible draughts. Footsteps echoed in empty corridors. Whether this was true, or whether the people merely projected their fear onto the place, matters little. The legend insists that the very stones became haunted because of him. To outsiders, the kingdom remained a land of strength and lineage, its banners flying proudly. But within, the air was thick with unease. How could a prince rule if he would not speak to his people? And worse, what if he carried counsel from beyond the grave, favoring the voices of the dead over the needs of the living? The tale does not begin with his deeds, then, but with his silence. It begins with the moment an entire kingdom began to question where the line between the living and the dead truly lay. Was he an innocent child cursed by fate? Or was he, as some whispered, the chosen vessel of a force older and darker than any crown? The chronicles will not give us certainty. They never do. They leave us with fragments, with contradictions, with absence where truth should stand. But in that absence, in the silence between the words, a shadow breathes. And it is there, in the very heart of that silence, that our story begins. The tale of the prince's birth does not open with joy, but with unease, as though the world itself resisted his arrival. Legends say the night was drenched in unnatural signs. A sudden eclipse, cutting the moon into a bleeding crescent, startled farmers awake. Livestock miscarried in their stalls. Wolves prowled closer to the villages than they had in years, their howls eerily synchronized. These omens were remembered and repeated, embroidered into folklore, until the prince's very birth became inseparable from dread. Midwives whispered afterward that something was not right in the birthing chamber. The air was stifling, heavy as if filled with unseen hands pressing against their throats. The queen labored for hours, her cries muffled behind heavy wooden doors guarded by knights who pretended not to hear. When the child emerged, the women present crossed themselves instinctively, for the infant did not wail as newborns should. Instead, he opened his eyes, wide, dark, unblinking, and looked straight at the shadows cast along the chamber walls. The silence was so complete that one midwife fainted, convinced she had witnessed not a birth but an intrusion. In a time when every omen carried political weight, this silence was not just a curiosity. It was a warning. Chroniclers later recorded that the court astrologer was summoned immediately, tasked with casting the child's horoscope. His notes, though partially destroyed, survive in fragments. The hour of his birth lies beneath a heavy conjunction. The stars bend inward. A voice not of this world clings to him. Within weeks, rumors spread beyond the palace, carried by servants, merchants, and clergy alike. A cursed heir, a child touched by death before he had even lived. The queen attempted to present her son with dignity, parading him before the nobles swaddled in gold-threaded cloth. Yet the whispers would not die. When courtiers leaned close, attempting to coax the child with playful sounds, his eyes did not follow them. Instead, his gaze fixed on empty space, as though listening to something beyond their comprehension. Mothers clutched their children tighter when he passed. Priests muttered blessings under their breath. It was not only the silence that disturbed them. The boy began to display strange behaviors, even in infancy. Servants claimed he turned his head toward doorways a moment before anyone entered, as though alerted by an unseen herald. When he lay in his crib, he often raised his hand as if gripping an invisible finger offered by someone no one else could see. Nurses reported that, instead of crying, he would sometimes laugh suddenly at odd hours of the night. Laughter directed not at them, but at the darkness of the chamber. Political rivals seized upon these stories. The dynasty was already fragile, beset by border wars and simmering unrest. To enemies, the boy's strange nature was proof of divine disfavor, an omen that the royal line was decaying. Pamphlets, circulated in whispers and secret meetings, accused the queen of sorcery, of consorting with spirits to conceive an unnatural child. The king, though outwardly dismissive, grew paranoid. He replaced the child's attendants constantly, believing the stories spread because of loose tongues. Yet no matter how many servants were dismissed, the rumors only multiplied. The clergy intervened. A bishop arrived at the castle, bearing relics and incense, determined to banish whatever presence might be clinging to the boy. According to legend, the child did not cry during the rite. Instead, he stared at the bishop with unbroken intensity until the man's voice faltered. Days later, the bishop left abruptly, citing illness, but many believed he had been unnerved beyond endurance. He never spoke of the incident again, and then came the first true horror. When the prince was barely 2 years old, a nursemaid was found weeping uncontrollably outside his chamber. She swore she had heard him speak, not babbling, but clear words, too articulate for his age. He had whispered a name, an unfamiliar one. Days later, a mason repairing part of the chapel collapsed, struck dead by a falling beam. When his body was brought for burial, the name carved on the coffin was the very one the boy had spoken. Such coincidences became the backbone of his legend. He was a child marked by death, his silence punctured only by moments when he revealed knowledge no living soul should possess. Whether these tales were invented after the fact or genuinely observed at the time, they hardened into folklore. The people began to murmur that he was not truly the king's son at all, but the child of some bargain struck with the dead. The court attempted to control the narrative. Physicians insisted he was merely slow to speak, that his behaviors were the result of an unsettled temperament. Chroniclers loyal to the crown wrote flattering accounts, claiming he was gifted with unusual wisdom, destined for greatness. But the common people believed otherwise. To them, the omens of his birth had already written the script of his life. He was cursed. He was chosen. He belonged, not to the living, but to the silent kingdom beneath the earth. And as he grew older, refusing to utter a single word to his family, his attendants, or even to the king himself, that belief only deepened. The prince was no longer just a child of omens. He was becoming a vessel for something that would shadow the dynasty for generations. The prince did not grow up in isolation. He grew up in a kingdom already steeped in misfortune. His family's dynasty was one whispered about in hushed tones by historians and courtiers alike, a lineage marked by sudden deaths, inexplicable tragedies, and rumors of ancestral curses that hung over the throne like a dark fog. Tales of blood spilled and betrayal, children dying before their time, and rulers driven mad by unseen forces were not merely superstition. They were the court's grim reality. The king, a man of stern countenance and rigid protocol, often reminded his advisors that the weight of the crown was heavier than any mortal could bear. Yet beneath the gilded halls and ceremonial pageantry, the royal household simmered with tension. Some said that every generation produced one child born under strange stars, one heir whose fate would be entwined with death and the supernatural. The boy who spoke only to the dead seemed to embody that dread in a tangible form. Stories of the family's misfortunes reached far beyond palace walls. A plague had once decimated an entire branch of the lineage, leaving only a single heir alive to carry the family name. A rival king, jealous of the dynasty's power, had poisoned the wine at a royal banquet centuries earlier, an act that killed half the royal council and left the reigning monarch in a state of despair. Even in peacetime, the family could not escape tragedy. Sudden illnesses, mysterious disappearances, and rumors of madness haunted the corridors of the castle like persistent ghosts. The court's chroniclers often documented these events with a mixture of reverence and fear, carefully balancing historical record with a pervasive belief in curses. One such chronicler, whose manuscripts survive in fragmented form, wrote of a prince from the past who walked with spirits as if they were servants, and whose words foretold doom for those who opposed him. This phrasing, repeated and amplified over generations, became almost prophetic when applied to the boy who spoke only to the dead. The family seemed fated to repeat its own darkness, generation after generation, each heir more haunted than the last. The prince's mother, a queen known for her intelligence and strict devotion to religious observance, was acutely aware of these patterns. She attempted to shield her son from the more sinister aspects of court life, but superstition was woven into every brick of the palace. The walls themselves seemed to whisper of past misdeeds. Servants spoke of paintings that cried tears, tapestries that shifted in the night, and portraits of ancestors whose eyes seemed to follow intruders with more than just the pretense of artistry. The queen could not protect her son from the weight of these legacies. Courtiers, meanwhile, observed the young prince with a mixture of fascination and fear. Some believed he was the reincarnation of a doomed ancestor, returned to settle old scores or fulfill unfinished prophecies. Others whispered that he was an embodiment of the family's curse itself, a living reminder of every death and betrayal that had stained their bloodline. These whispers grew louder as the boy displayed behaviors no one could rationalize. Mutinous to the living, yet uncanny knowledge of events long past, and a precocious awareness of death that unsettled even the most hardened knights. Outside the palace, the kingdom itself seemed to reflect the family's ill fate. Harvests failed in cycles that aligned with the family's tragedies. Storms struck without warning, rivers flooded, and strange, unnatural occurrences were often reported by peasants. Sudden fires, livestock behaving violently, and ghostly figures glimpsed at the edges of forests. Folk tales began to link these calamities to the royal house, suggesting that the family carried a supernatural burden, a shadow that extended beyond the castle walls into every corner of their domain. The prince's presence intensified this perception. If the family had always been haunted by history, he was the living symbol of its continuity. His silence, his nighttime murmurs, his apparent communion with spirits, all made the ancient warnings feel immediate. Every courtier who observed him could not help but wonder whether the boy was merely a vessel of knowledge or a harbinger of further doom. The line between superstition and reality blurred. Even those skeptical of the supernatural began to act as if the family's curse were real, making decisions driven by fear of what might come, rather than reason. Historians looking back see this as a kingdom caught between two worlds, one of political intrigue and dynastic ambition, the other of folklore and the inexplicable. The prince, born into a lineage already steeped in tragedy, became the embodiment of that duality. He was a child of blood and shadow, destined to inherit both the crown and the haunted legacy that accompanied it. Every misfortune, every whispered tale of ancestors undone by betrayal or violence, seemed to converge upon him, shaping a story in which the past refused to remain buried. By the time the prince reached the age when he could understand his surroundings, he was surrounded by a tapestry of fear and expectation. He lived among reminders of what had been lost, what had been broken, and what had never healed. The royal house, with its long history of shadowed deeds and whispered curses, became both a cradle and a cage for a boy whose destiny would forever be linked to the dead. Within these walls, the stage was set for a life that would blur the line between history and legend, between the living and the dead. In this environment, the prince's gift, or curse, was inevitable. He did not emerge into a world of peace or certainty, but into one that was primed for whispers, for fear, for awe. The royal house had prepared him unknowingly for his communion with the departed. The misfortunes of the past were the foundation upon which his story would be built, ensuring that every shadow, every sigh of the castle, every flicker of candlelight would be laden with expectation and dread. In essence, the boy was not just part of a royal dynasty. He was the living echo of its haunted history. The prince's childhood, shrouded in silence and shadow, unfolded like a private nightmare observed only by the servants who dared to enter his chambers. Those who cared for him spoke in hushed tones, recounting strange behaviors that defied explanation and strained the limits of their courage. It was said that even as a toddler, he would spend hours sitting motionless in his crib, staring at empty corners as though listening to distant voices. Sometimes he would laugh softly, a sound too deliberate to be the innocent play of a child, echoing faintly as if replying to invisible interlocutors. The nursery became a stage for phenomena that both frightened and fascinated those who attended him. Toys were often found arranged in unusual patterns, dolls facing each other in silent conversation, blocks stacked to resemble tombstones, miniature carriages paused as though awaiting mourners. Nurses reported hearing him whisper names of people no one in the castle had met, names of the long dead, kings, queens, generals, and peasants whose lives had vanished from memory. These utterances were fleeting, almost inaudible, yet precise, as if he were recounting the details of history rather than inventing fantasies. Attempts to socialize the prince with other children met with failure. Young heirs and daughters of courtiers were sent to play with him, their laughter bright against the shadow of his nursery, yet he remained indifferent. He would not speak to them, nor respond to their games. Some claimed he would smile at them in silence, while others swore he spoke to their shadows rather than to them. Fear grew among the children of the court. Parents began to forbid contact, whispering warnings about the boy who listened to those who had passed. Servants' accounts grew darker as he aged. One nurse, trembling in later years, recounted how she saw him reach toward an empty corner of a room, tracing his fingers in the air as though drawing invisible sigils. At times, he would rock back and forth while murmuring in a low tone, pausing only to nod at the ceiling or walls. Footsteps were sometimes heard responding in rhythm with his murmurs, though no one could see another presence. Some believed these were spirits answering him, forming a hidden court in the shadows that only he could command. The boy's unusual habits were not confined to the nursery itself. At night, he was known to leave his bed and wander the castle silently, passing through hallways lit only by moonlight or flickering candles. Maids and guards who followed him, often reluctantly, claimed to witness him pause in front of portraits of ancestors, speaking softly as though consulting the dead about the affairs of the day. Objects would move slightly when he passed, as if acknowledging him, and doors that were firmly closed would sometimes creak open without cause. The castle, once a safe and orderly space, seemed to bend around the prince, yielding to forces unseen. Local folklore began to intertwine with these observations. Villagers who visited the castle for festivals or trade whispered tales of a child in the tower who could converse with the departed. They described hearing faint laughter carried on the wind and lights moving behind shuttered windows at odd hours. Some swore the prince predicted tragedies among the common folk, uttering warnings to his attendants about fires, drownings, and sudden illnesses, predictions that, more often than not, came true. The nursery, meant to be a sanctuary for childhood, became in these stories a nexus of the uncanny, a place where time and death seemed to converge. The psychological impact on those caring for him was profound. Nurses confessed that they slept lightly, if at all, hearing whispers in the dark and feeling unseen presences brush against their skin. One chronicler, recording these accounts decades later, noted that even the most devout attendants began to fear the boy as much as they revered him. Fear and awe were inseparable in his presence. It was not malevolence in the child, they claimed, but an awareness of a world they could not touch, a knowledge that was both brilliant and terrifying. By the time he reached school age, the prince had already developed a reputation for speaking truths that no living person could have known. Tutors tasked with teaching him letters, arithmetic, and history were astonished to find him reciting events of battles and deaths from decades prior, as if recounting eyewitness accounts. When questioned, he would remain silent, or sometimes reply in hushed tones to his unseen companions. Attempts to discipline him were met with stubborn silence, leaving adults frustrated, unsettled, and increasingly convinced that the child's mind belonged partially to another realm. Even within the royal household, the whispers began to shape behavior. Courtiers were cautious about speaking in his presence, fearing that private conversations might be repeated by some unknown, spectral auditor. The queen herself, though deeply devoted, grew anxious. She began to seek counsel from astrologers, mystics, and priests, trying desperately to understand the boy's abilities, or perhaps to suppress them. Yet whatever intervention was attempted only reinforced the sense that he operated under a different set of rules, governed not by the laws of the living, but by the unseen orders of death itself. It was in these early years, in the nursery filled with shadows, whispers, and the faint scent of incense used to ward spirits, that the prince began to forge the habits which would define him for life. He learned to listen, not just to the living, but to the dead, and to respond in a manner that blurred the line between childhood innocence and supernatural authority. By the time he emerged from the nursery, he was no longer merely a royal heir. He was a conduit, a child who carried the weight of the past and the whispers of those long departed. In every glance, every murmur, and every gesture, the nursery had shaped him into something both revered and feared, setting the stage for a life that would forever intertwine the palace with the world beyond the grave. As the prince grew older, his silence began to ripple beyond the nursery, reaching the stately chambers and marble halls of the royal court. Where once the court had been a place of calculated politeness and ceremonial grandeur, it now quivered with unease. Courtiers who had once spoken freely now tread lightly, wary that even their whispered conversations might reach the ears of the boy who spoke only to the dead. Ambassadors were unsettled by his presence, remarking in letters that he never answered questions directly, yet somehow always seemed to know more than he could have learned by ordinary means. The king, proud and resolute, found himself frustrated and unnerved. How could an heir be trained for rulership if he refused to communicate with advisors, generals, and diplomats? Councils were disrupted. The boy's tutors could no longer discipline him with threats of rebuke or corporal punishment. Clergy insisted on various interventions, prayers, exorcisms, and ritual blessings. But even these were met with the prince's impenetrable calm, as though the rituals themselves were merely echoes in a world he already understood in ways the living could not perceive. Physicians examined him constantly, diagnosing a multitude of possible conditions. Some believed he suffered from selective mutism, while others feared an imbalance of the humors, a melancholia that had descended from generations past. Yet no diagnosis could account for the unnatural clarity of his eyes, the precision of his whispered names, or the uncanny knowledge of events hidden from mortal memory. The court grew divided. Some regarded him as an innocent child, remarkable for his intelligence, while others suspected something far darker, a boy guided by forces beyond human comprehension. The prince's influence, or presence, began to affect the behavior of those around him. Courtiers avoided private arguments in his presence, fearing he might overhear and later repeat details in ways that could disrupt alliances. Meetings of state were often conducted in whispered tones, strategic plans revised multiple times in anticipation of the unseen audience in the prince's silent gaze. Those who served him closely, tutors, stewards, and maids, reported sleepless nights, plagued by the feeling of being observed, by whispers they could not locate, by shadows that seemed to linger long after their source had moved. Religious figures approached his muteness with a mixture of fear and reverence. Priests debated whether the boy was divinely touched or possessed by malevolent spirits. Some sought to train him, guiding his prayers and teaching him scripture, believing that devotion could coax him toward the living. Others advised restraint, warning that forcing communication could awaken forces too powerful for any mortal hand to control. The tension between faith and fear became a constant backdrop to the prince's upbringing, shaping the court's perception of him as a figure both miraculous and terrifying. The boy's silence also carried political consequences. Nobles and advisors debated whether he could inherit the throne, whether his inability to speak to the living rendered him unfit to rule. Rivals whispered that a king who could not communicate was a king who could be manipulated, or worse, undone by the dead himself. Yet paradoxically, some saw in him a potential power unlike any other, a ruler who, guided by knowledge of what had already occurred, could navigate crises with uncanny foresight. The court was caught between reverence and suspicion, unable to settle on whether the boy was a blessing, a curse, or both. Stories began to spread of incidents that defied explanation. One chronicler wrote of a banquet where the prince, seated quietly at the head table, suddenly named a guest as a traitor, someone long dead and forgotten in the annals of the kingdom's history. The accused reportedly turned pale, though none could verify the boy's words at the time. Incidents like this cemented his growing reputation. He was a silent observer, a keeper of secrets, a child whose counsel might only be sought in whispers and at a fearful distance. Despite the fear, some began to interpret the prince's behavior as a form of intelligence superior to that of any living courtier. He learned, with meticulous precision, the movements of the court, the alliances, the betrayals, the subtle hierarchies. He read the body language of nobles with uncanny insight, predicting arguments before they arose and identifying deceit with a glance. It was as if his muteness was not a handicap, but a form of power, a channel through which he absorbed the invisible currents of courtly life while the living remained blind to the subtle truths surrounding them. And yet, the unease never faded. Even those closest to him felt a chill, a sense that the boy operated according to rules beyond mortal understanding. He was a presence that reshaped the very rhythm of the palace, forcing all who lived and worked there to adjust to a reality in which the unseen held sway. Every conversation, every decision, every movement of the court became subject to the possibility that it might be observed, judged, or influenced by one who walked in silence, guided by voices that only he could hear. In this way, the prince's muteness became not just a personal trait, but a force within the kingdom itself. His silence dictated behavior, shaped politics, and cast a shadow over all who served him. The court, once a realm of structure and decorum, had become a theater of tension, where the living played their parts carefully, fearful of awakening the attention of a boy who conversed with the dead. It was here, amidst whispered fears and unseen authority, that the young prince's legend as a silent but omniscient figure began to solidify, a legend that would haunt both the corridors of power and the memory of a kingdom for generations to come. By the time the prince reached adolescence, his relationship with the dead had grown from whispers in the nursery to a language all his own, a private dialogue that unsettled the living and fascinated the curious. It was said that he could enter a room, close his eyes, and recount conversations of those long buried, repeating words no one could have known. Names, secrets, confessions, and warnings spilled from him in a cadence that suggested both ritual and memory. Those who observed him noted that he did not speak aloud in ordinary conversation, yet when he whispered to the unseen, the precision of his speech rivaled the most learned chroniclers of the kingdom. This uncanny skill, which many referred to as the language of the dead, blurred the boundaries between genius, madness, and the supernatural. Scholars who were later granted access to fragments of his journals noted that he had begun to codify what he heard: small symbols and sketches, cryptic notations of names, dates, and locations. Sometimes he would draw figures in the margin of his texts, resembling court officials or soldiers, only to later indicate that these representations were more than mere illustration. They were records of the spirits who visited him. Those who glimpsed these texts were left in awe and horror, struggling to understand how a boy could possess knowledge of events and people beyond the reach of the living. The court responded with a mixture of fear, reverence, and strategic calculation. Some nobles attempted to curry favor with the prince, bringing their petitions in hushed whispers, hoping he might carry their messages to the unseen, the only channel through which he seemed to truly operate. Others avoided him entirely, fearful that his words could reveal long-buried betrayals or sins, or that his communion with the dead might turn against them politically. Even the king, though bound by blood, could not fully comprehend the extent of his son's abilities and treated each incident with guarded caution, oscillating between awe, anxiety, and resignation. The prince's nocturnal activities became more deliberate and structured as he aged. He would spend hours in the castle's abandoned chapels, sitting alone on cold stone floors, murmuring to the shadows. Servants swore they sometimes saw him rise mid-ritual and follow invisible processions, bowing, kneeling, and addressing figures that were not there. Candles flickered as if responding to his speech. Doors opened and closed on their own. Faint voices seemed to echo from the walls. Whether these phenomena were real or projections of collective fear is impossible to verify, yet they contributed to the legend that the prince was a medium, a bridge between worlds, whose language could summon, converse with, and even command the dead. Local folklore began to codify these reports. Villagers spoke of a boy who could summon messages from beyond the grave, who knew secrets before they occurred, who could relay the regrets of ancestors with eerie accuracy. Some said he could predict deaths, misfortunes, and betrayals, naming individuals by title and location with no human source of knowledge. The stories painted him as a spectral envoy, neither holy child nor holy spirit, a figure through whom the past pressed into the present. The term language of the dead began to circulate, not as a description of superstition, but as an accepted, if fearful, fact of the prince's existence. The prince's mastery of this language was not without its costs. Those who tried to coax him into ordinary conversation reported that he would sometimes respond with words that chilled them. The names of ancestors who had been betrayed, the fates of children who had vanished in famine, the sins of ministers long dead. Such revelations were precise, yet often painful, revealing the grim underbelly of history that rulers preferred to forget. The young prince, by speaking to those who could not answer, became a mirror for the kingdom's hidden truths, a conduit for knowledge that was feared as much as it was revered. Religious authorities were torn. Some insisted that he was blessed with divine insight, a child prophet whose communion with the dead served a holy purpose. Others warned that his abilities were unnatural, a temptation toward necromancy that could bring ruin upon the dynasty. Rituals were attempted, incantations recited, holy water sprinkled, but the prince remained unshaken, communicating in whispers and gestures that defied interpretation. His silence to the living only magnified the potency of the messages he delivered to the dead, emphasizing a distinction that everyone in the court felt. He belonged more to the past than to the present, more to shadows than to sunlight. It was during this period that his reputation crystallized. By adolescence, he was no longer merely the silent heir. He was the child who spoke in the tongue of the departed, whose knowledge encompassed histories both public and secret. Nobles, scholars, and servants alike navigated their interactions with him cautiously, understanding that his influence extended beyond observation and into a realm they could neither control nor fully comprehend. His language became a force that shaped behavior, inspired fear, and commanded a form of respect that transcended his years. In essence, the prince became a living archive of the kingdom's dead, a repository of voices, memories, and secrets that no mortal could otherwise access. He was a figure suspended between the ordinary and the spectral, a child whose words belonged simultaneously to this world and the next. In every whisper, every symbol, every gesture, the language of the dead carved its mark upon the court, leaving a legacy of unease, fascination, and a chilling certainty. The prince was not merely a royal heir, but a bridge to a world most feared to acknowledge. The prince's adolescence was not only marked by his communion with the dead, but also by the first undeniable omen of calamity that would forever cement his reputation as a harbinger of doom. It began in the depths of winter, when the kingdom was cloaked in frost and fog, and the air itself seemed heavy with anticipation. Whispers spread through the court that something terrible was imminent, though no one could say what. The prince, as always, remained silent to the living. Yet those who observed him noted a subtle change. His gestures grew more deliberate, his murmurs more urgent, and his gaze fixed upon corners of the castle where shadows seemed thickest. It was during a council meeting that the first public sign emerged. The king and his advisors were debating matters of war and diplomacy, a subject that had always been a source of tension. The prince sat quietly, ostensibly listening, when he suddenly interrupted with a series of whispered phrases, not to the council, but to himself, a sequence of names, dates, and events that no living witness could have known. A servant present, straining to hear, later recounted that the names belonged to soldiers who had died decades prior, yet the prince spoke of them as if they were arriving at that very moment, marching unseen through the palace halls. Within days, the prophecy or omen began to manifest. Reports arrived that a convoy of soldiers had been ambushed in a neighboring province, their deaths eerily mirroring the events the prince had described. Courtiers were terrified, some accusing him of sorcery, others claiming divine foresight. The king, torn between paternal concern and political necessity, sought counsel from astrologers and priests, demanding explanations for the boy's uncanny knowledge. Their responses offered no comfort. Some insisted the prince was gifted, a vessel chosen by higher powers. Others warned that the dead were whispering for a reason, their voices a prelude to catastrophe. The palace itself seemed to respond to the prince's revelations. Servants reported doors swinging open without cause, wind gusting along empty corridors, and the flickering of candlelight synchronized with the boy's murmured incantations. Animals became restless, dogs howled, birds refused to roost, and even seasoned guards confessed to an oppressive sense of dread that pervaded the castle. Shadows appeared elongated and unnatural, as if bending toward the prince, acknowledging him, or perhaps warning him of the approaching disaster. Commoners began to hear of the boy's words and acts. Merchants spoke of strange predictions carried by their children who had glimpsed the palace from afar. Villagers whispered that the prince could see into the realm of the dead and speak their language with precision, and that the first omen of doom had already begun. Fear permeated not only the court but the kingdom itself, as people speculated whether famine, plague, war, or betrayal was imminent, knowing only that the boy's silence masked a terrifying knowledge of what was to come. The king's attempts to shield his son from the mounting anxiety were in vain. Advisors demanded explanations, nobles feared retribution, and the clergy warned that ignoring the prince's whispers could bring divine wrath. Even the queen, devoted and protective, could not dissuade the court from interpreting his silence as something ominous, something dangerous. The young prince, accustomed to the attention of both living and dead, seemed unaffected by their panic, yet observers remarked that there was a weight in his presence, a gravity that pulled the living toward caution and fear. The first omen extended beyond mere prediction. It became action. Soldiers assigned to investigate the province where the death had occurred returned with fragmented reports, describing scenes of violence, fire, and betrayal that mirrored exactly what the prince had spoken. Chroniclers began to note that the boy's words carried authority over reality itself, a terrifying implication that he was not merely observing the dead, but acting as a conduit through which their unresolved fates touched the living world. From that point on, the prince's reputation shifted irrevocably. No longer was he seen merely as a curious or silent child. He became a figure whose very presence announced consequence, whose whispers foretold calamity. Courtiers who had once debated his suitability as heir now avoided confronting him directly, deferring to his unseen counsel, wary of awakening the forces he seemed to command. To the kingdom, he was no longer just a prince. He was an omen, a living harbinger whose understanding of death and fate surpassed all human comprehension. This first omen of doom marked a turning point in both the boy's life and the kingdom's perception of him. Fear, awe, and superstition intertwined to create a legend that would not fade with age. From this moment onward, his silence became even more potent, his whispers to the dead more consequential, and his reputation as a bridge between the living and the spectral world permanently sealed. Every movement, every gesture, every glance would be interpreted as a message, a warning, or a prophecy. The first omen had arrived, and with it, the undeniable proof that the prince's destiny was inextricably linked to forces beyond mortal understanding. The night of the shattered seal arrived with the hush of an unnatural twilight, a darkness so deep that even the stars seemed to avoid the sky above the castle. It was a night remembered in hushed chronicles and whispered ballads, though records are scarce and conflicting. Some say it occurred during a season of famine, others during a plague, but the consensus among surviving manuscripts is clear. The night changed the kingdom, and the prince forever. It began with a sense of foreboding that crept through the castle long before the event itself. Servants spoke of a chill that lingered despite roaring hearths, shadows that moved independently of the flickering candles, and a hush over the corridors that felt like the breath of the dead. The prince, as always, remained in his chamber, seated before a small altar he had begun to keep in secret. Candles circled the perimeter of the room, their flames bending toward him as if drawn by invisible currents, illuminating a scene of ritual both intimate and unsettling. Symbols had been etched into the floor, unfamiliar to all but the boy, forming a pattern that some later chroniclers described as a seal between the living and the dead. The first witnesses to the event were the attendants who served him in shifts, each later recalling that they had never seen the boy so intensely focused. His lips moved, barely audibly, as though conversing with unseen entities. Faint murmurs, almost indecipherable, rose and fell in cadence with the flickering of the candles. Some swear they saw shadows detach from the walls, circling the prince as if paying homage or awaiting instruction. The air grew heavy, thick with a scent like cold iron and earth, an aroma that carried the unmistakable essence of graves disturbed. Outside the chamber, the palace seemed to tremble. Doors that were locked tight swung open, slamming against stone with the force of some unseen hand. Tapestries waved though no breeze entered, and footsteps echoed through empty corridors, synchronized with the whispers emanating from the prince's room. Guards stationed nearby reported a disorienting sensation, as if they were being pulled into another realm, a liminal space where time and reality blurred. Some fainted, others fled, their faces pale and voices trembling with reports they could scarcely articulate. The climax of the night occurred when the seal itself was broken. Chroniclers, writing decades later, claimed that the symbols etched on the floor began to glow faintly, a pale light that pulsed in rhythm with the prince's murmurs. The candle's flames intensified, casting jagged, moving shadows that seemed almost corporeal. A sound was heard, described as a low, resonant shattering, though no object in the room could account for it. Some attendants claimed the walls themselves had groaned, a deep vibration that traveled through stone and flesh alike. When the glow faded, the prince remained standing, unscathed and serene, while those around him reported seeing faces in the flickering shadows, faces of the dead, old and new, gazing at him with recognition or deference. The immediate aftermath left the palace in chaos. Nobles and clergy, rushing to investigate, found the prince calm, sitting at the center of a scene that seemed frozen in time. The altar, the symbols, the candles, all bore no trace of disturbance beyond the testimony of those who had witnessed the event. But the attendants' accounts were consistent. The veil between the living and dead had, for a moment, been lifted, and the prince had been at its center, speaking in a tongue that was at once human and otherworldly. Word of the night spread quickly, reaching even the farthest reaches of the kingdom. Villagers claimed to see lights moving behind the castle's windows, accompanied by soft, sorrowful murmurs that carried across frozen fields. Rumors spoke of spectral processions, of the prince walking among the dead, negotiating secrets of the past and future alike. Nobles debated in whispered councils whether the boy should be controlled, revered, or feared, and the clergy intensified rituals of prayer and consecration, seeking to ensure that no malevolent force had been unleashed. The night of the shattered seal was more than an isolated incident. It became a defining moment in the prince's life. From that night onward, he was no longer simply a silent observer of the dead. He was an active participant, a mediator who could command, summon, and negotiate with spirits in ways the living could barely comprehend. The legend surrounding him solidified. He was the boy who had pierced the veil, whose communion had shaken both palace and kingdom, whose presence now carried an almost unbearable weight of expectation and dread. Even the king, once hesitant, could not ignore the implications. Advisors urged caution, whispering that the boy's powers might destabilize alliances, incite fear, or even invite supernatural vengeance. Yet others argued that his abilities, however terrifying, might serve the kingdom in unforeseen ways, forewarning disasters, uncovering treachery, or offering guidance from the past. The debate would continue for decades, but the night of the shattered seal remained undeniable, a moment where the prince's communion with the dead transcended legend and became reality, a night forever etched into the annals of a kingdom teetering between mortal rule and spectral influence. Thus, the prince's path was irreversibly altered. He became a figure both revered and feared, a boy whose destiny was intertwined with the dead, a child whose actions hinted at powers that would haunt not only his family, but the kingdom itself for generations. The night of the shattered seal marked the beginning of a lifetime in which the boundaries between life and death, between history and legend, would blur, and where the whispers of the dead would dictate the living's every step. In the months and years following the night of the shattered seal, the prince's reputation as a bridge between the living and the dead solidified into something far darker. A curse, whispered in fear throughout the kingdom. No longer was he merely a boy of strange abilities. He became a symbol of inevitability, a living omen whose presence seemed to draw misfortune like a lodestone. Courtiers spoke in hushed tones of disasters that inexplicably followed him, attributing each plague, fire, or untimely death to the silent boy who conversed with the dead. The first signs of the curse manifested in subtle ways. Harvests that had once been reliable failed unexpectedly. Animals perished in stables without explanation, and servants reported illnesses that no physician could cure. Each incident, though individually explainable, gained weight and significance when observed in conjunction with the prince's activities. Whispers began to spread. Every misfortune bore his shadow. Every death answered to his silent call. The court grew tense, every action measured for its potential to invoke his attention or wrath. The prince himself remained unchanged outwardly, calm and focused, yet those closest to him began to experience a growing sense of dread. Tutors, once confident in their influence, found their instructions disregarded. The boys' responses to lessons, muted murmurs to unseen interlocutors, left them shaken. Attendants reported strange coincidences. A whispered name would coincide with a sudden illness. A gesture toward a corridor would precede a fire in a distant wing. Some began to believe that the prince did not merely predict fate, but exerted subtle control over it, guiding events through the unseen influence of the dead he consulted. Local folklore absorbed and magnified these reports. Villagers who had glimpsed the prince from afar began to claim that even looking at him could invite misfortune. Tales spread of families ruined, livestock lost, and marriages undone, all traced back, in rumor, to the boy's silent gaze or whispered incantations. The notion of a curse became so entrenched that even the clergy, who had once attempted to protect and guide him, now advised caution. Some priests performed daily blessings over the palace, hoping to shield the living from his influence, while others argued that the boy's powers were divine, his curse merely a reflection of the sins of the kingdom and the dead he served. Within the royal household, paranoia grew. Nobles became distrustful, suspecting each other of manipulating or exploiting the prince's abilities. Fear mingled with ambition. Courtiers sought to curry favor or avoid his attention, knowing that a misstep might invite ruin. The queen, torn between maternal love and the undeniable influence her son seemed to wield, sought solace in prayer and ritual, though even she could not escape the perception that her heir was no ordinary child, but a vessel of forces beyond comprehension or control. The prince's own development mirrored the darkness surrounding him. He became increasingly withdrawn from the living, more devoted to the invisible court of spirits he consulted daily. Scholars and scribes who attempted to record his utterances noted that the messages from the dead grew more urgent, more complex, and more ominous. These were not idle conversations. They were warnings, admonitions, and revelations of hidden truths that often spelled danger for the living. The prince was no longer a passive observer. He was an active participant in a spectral dialogue that shaped the fate of the kingdom, whether anyone acknowledged it or not. The tangible effects of the curse became impossible to ignore. Minor accidents escalated into tragedies. A servant slipping on icy steps would lead to the collapse of a bridge. A mislaid candle would ignite a fire that consumed an entire wing of the palace. In each case, witnesses swore that the prince had been nearby, speaking to the dead, his gaze fixed upon unseen shapes. These incidents reinforced the perception that misfortune was not merely coincidental, but directly tied to his presence and abilities. Fear of the boy transformed into superstition, and superstition into reverence. It was during this period that secret councils began to form, attempting to contain the curse without harming the prince. Advisors debated isolation, confinement, or ritual suppression, yet no consensus emerged. The king feared both the loss of his heir and the wrath of whatever forces guided him. Courtiers hesitated to act, torn between loyalty, fear, and a desperate hope that the prince's powers might one day avert disaster instead of bringing it. The tension within the palace was palpable, a constant reminder that the prince's silence and communion with the dead were not benign traits, but a force with unpredictable, often catastrophic consequences. Thus, the curse took root not in a single act, but through a series of unfolding events that intertwined the prince's life with the misfortunes of the kingdom. It was a curse recognized as both literal and symbolic, a mark of power and terror, a presence whose influence could be felt in every corner of the castle, every hall of power, and every hearth of the village. The kingdom learned, slowly and painfully, that to live in proximity to the prince was to live under a shadow, an invisible, inescapable weight that connected life and death, past and future, in ways that defied reason or relief. By the end of this chapter in his life, the boy who spoke only to the dead had become a figure of dread and inevitability. The curse was no longer rumor or superstition. It was accepted reality. The people of the kingdom moved cautiously around him, their lives measured in relation to his gaze and whispered words. And within the boy himself, the seeds of understanding and perhaps inevitability were taking hold. He was no longer simply a child. He was a force, entwined with the kingdom's destiny, a living embodiment of the dead's silent will, whose every act shaped both the present and the shadowed future. As the years passed, the kingdom became increasingly aware of the dual power of the prince. Not only could he commune with the dead, but he could also uncover secrets hidden in the hearts of the living. Whispers of betrayal began to circulate, initially subtle, almost imperceptible, yet growing louder with every courtly gathering. Courtiers who had once dismissed the boy's silence as eccentric now feared that he knew more than any advisor, more than any spy, more than even the king himself. His gaze seemed to pierce through the layers of pretense and deceit, revealing intentions that would otherwise remain hidden, and in so doing, sowing tension that had long been dormant. It was said that no lie could survive his presence. Letters meant to be private were reportedly referenced by the prince in hushed, cryptic statements, exposing plots and schemes before they could take root. Nobles found themselves second-guessing their words, actions, and alliances, aware that even their whispers could reach his ears, and perhaps the ears of the dead. Those who sought to manipulate him or test his abilities quickly discovered that the consequences could be dire. Reports of sudden illnesses, financial ruin, or mysterious accidents often followed those who were found conspiring against him, reinforcing the belief that his silent observation was intertwined with some supernatural justice. The whispers of betrayal were not limited to minor intrigues. One infamous incident, recorded by a chronicler decades later, describes a council meeting where a prominent duke plotted to undermine the king. The prince, seated silently at the edge of the chamber, later recited the names of all conspirators and detailed their plans in precise, chilling terms. Within days, the duke's carefully laid plot collapsed. Allies abandoned him. Resources vanished, and scandal engulfed his household. While many insisted that coincidence could explain some of these events, The cumulative weight of such incidents created an undeniable impression. The prince's knowledge of betrayal was beyond mortal capacity, and it carried consequences. Even the royal family was not immune to suspicion. The queen, despite her devotion, began to wonder whether the boy's communion with the dead was also a conduit for truth among the living. Family tensions, once private, became subject to scrutiny. Subtle offenses or hidden resentments surfaced under the prince's observation, sometimes revealed in cryptic, unsettling phrases that suggested both insight and judgment. The king himself, though protective, grew wary, realizing that no secret, no slight, and no deception could remain hidden. The palace, once a place of carefully maintained appearances, began to fracture under the pressure of unseen eyes and unspoken truths. Servants and attendants played a dangerous role as intermediaries. Some became informants, reporting any unusual behavior or hidden conversation to the prince, hoping to curry favor or avert disaster. Others, driven by fear, attempted to avoid him altogether, fearing that mere proximity could implicate them in some unseen wrongdoing. Whispers spread through the halls like a living organism, feeding on the tension that surrounded the boy. Those who had previously sought to ridicule or ignore him now treated him with reverence, caution, or outright terror, wary of becoming the next subject of his silent, spectral judgment. The prince's influence extended beyond mere observation. It shaped decisions and alliances. Advisors became hesitant to engage in aggressive political maneuvers, fearing that the prince's knowledge, and a knowledge of those he communed with, would unmask deception and assign blame with ruthless precision. The nobility's usual machinations, so reliant on secrecy and strategy, were rendered ineffective in the face of a boy who could not be bribed, threatened, or distracted. Even long-standing rivalries paused, temporarily subdued by the weight of his silent authority and the unseen eyes he carried with him. Stories of betrayal and retribution began to enter folklore alongside the more supernatural elements of the prince's legend. Minstrels sang of courtiers undone by secrets only a boy could discern, while villagers spoke in whispers of a child who saw the heart of man, who could uncover lies hidden even from the most cunning. These tales blurred the lines between reality and legend, creating a climate in which the prince was not just feared for his communication with the dead, but also for his uncanny ability to reveal the hidden sins and ambitions of the living. By adolescence, the cumulative effect of his revelations had begun to shape the kingdom itself. Fear tempered ambition. Whispers of betrayal ensured that actions were calculated not only for political advantage, but also for survival under the scrutiny of a boy who listened to the dead. The court became a labyrinth of caution, each step measured against the possibility of exposure. Trust was fragile, alliances tentative, and no secret felt safe. The prince's silence had become an instrument of control, wielded not with malice, but with inevitability, an invisible force that reshaped the behavior of all who dwelled within the palace. Ultimately, the whispers of betrayal were both a reflection of the prince's growing power and a testament to the unsettling truth that in a kingdom where the living and dead overlapped, knowledge itself could become a weapon. The boy who spoke only to the dead was also a boy who saw through the masks of the living, whose presence ensured that deceit carried immediate consequence. Fear, respect, and superstition intertwined, solidifying his role as both guardian and judge, a figure whose silent observation reshaped the very fabric of loyalty, trust, and survival within the realm. By the end of this chapter, the prince's legend had grown yet darker. He was no longer simply the boy who conversed with the dead, or the harbinger of omens. He had become the unseen arbiter of truth, a silent authority whose gaze could unravel conspiracies and whose whispers could alter the course of lives. The kingdom learned, in whispers and in fear, that betrayal could not escape the ears of the dead, or the boy who listened to them. The vanishing of the courtier marked one of the most chilling episodes in the prince's adolescence, an incident that would be whispered in hushed tones for decades, weaving itself into both the kingdom's folklore and its history. It began with a minor courtier, a man of moderate influence, whose ambition and pride made him careless. This courtier, confident in his cunning, sought to undermine the prince's authority subtly, spreading rumors and testing the limits of the boy's silence. He treated the prince as a curious child, a novelty to be dismissed rather than a force to be feared. The first signs that something was amiss were subtle. Servants reported strange occurrences in the courtier's quarters, objects displaced inexplicably, doors closing of their own accord, and cold drafts that seemed to follow him like a shadow. Whispers, faint but persistent, filled the hallways, often echoing words the prince had been heard murmuring alone. At first, the courtier dismissed these incidents as superstition, the idle imaginings of fearful staff. But soon, he could no longer ignore the pattern. Misfortunes seemed to accompany every action he took. Messages arrived late or not at all. Allies faltered, abandoning their support, and his reputation began to unravel in inexplicable ways. One evening, during a lavish banquet, the courtier attempted to confront the prince, hoping to humiliate him publicly. He mocked the boy's silence, questioning his authority and dismissing the legends of his communion with the dead. The prince, as always, remained unmoved, his eyes fixed on a distant corner of the hall, lips pressed together. Observers later recounted that the temperature dropped suddenly, a frost creeping along the floorboards as if the room itself responded to the prince's presence. Candles flickered violently, and shadows seemed to elongate unnaturally, bending toward the boy. The courtier's bravado faltered, yet he persisted, unaware that he was stepping into a realm beyond mortal understanding. By nightfall, the courtier vanished. His chambers were found empty, bed unmade, personal effects untouched. No footprints led to the door, no signs of escape were evident, and the guard stationed nearby swore they had heard nothing unusual. Panic spread quickly through the palace, and an extensive search yielded no trace of the man. Rumors spread like wildfire. Some claimed he had been spirited away by the dead, summoned by the prince's silent commands. Others suggested a supernatural punishment, an invisible hand guiding the boy's will. Even those who sought rational explanations, assassination, secret flight, or foul play, found no evidence to support them. The courtier had simply vanished, leaving only the weight of fear behind. The incident had profound implications for the court. Nobles who had once toyed with defiance now approached the prince with caution bordering on reverence. Every word, every gesture, every glance was measured, as if the boy's silent observation could reach into the soul and judge intent. The disappearance of the courtier became a symbol, an example of the consequences awaiting those who underestimated the prince's uncanny abilities. It was a warning etched into the psyche of the entire kingdom. No deceit could go unnoticed, and no mortal could challenge the boy who spoke to the dead without risking fate itself. Accounts of the vanishing vary in detail, filtered through years of retelling. Some chroniclers describe the courtier appearing briefly in the halls, his expression frozen in terror, before dissolving into shadows. Others speak of a pale light that accompanied his disappearance, emanating from the prince's chamber, as if a bridge between the living and dead had been opened and the man had stepped, or been drawn, through it. Regardless of the specifics, the impact was undeniable. The prince's authority had shifted from passive observation to active, almost supernatural enforcement. The vanishing also intensified the aura of fear surrounding the prince. Courtiers whispered of unseen eyes following them, of soft murmurs echoing their secrets, and of the subtle but unmistakable sense that the boy could reach into the realm of the dead to enact judgment. Servants slept lightly, guards grew anxious, and the palace itself seemed to respond to his moods and intentions. Even the king, proud and resolute, recognized the transformation. The boy who had once been merely silent now wielded power that surpassed the living, a force that could shape events without lifting a hand. The incident gave rise to stories and folklore that would persist for generations. Minstrels sang of the vanished courtier, weaving his disappearance into ballads of the boy prince who commanded spirits and exacted justice beyond the grave. Villagers recounted tales of shadowy processions in the palace at night, of lights and whispers that foretold danger, and of a boy whose silent gaze could decide life and death. These narratives reinforced the duality of fear and reverence surrounding the prince, cementing his reputation as both protector and harbinger, a child whose very presence commanded obedience and awe. Ultimately, the vanishing of the courtier marked a turning point in the prince's adolescence. It was a moment when the abstract fear of his abilities became tangible, when the court acknowledged that the boy was no longer merely a passive conduit of the dead, but an active agent whose will could reshape reality. From that night onward, the courtier's fate became a lesson. The prince's silence was never empty, his murmurs were never idle, and the boundaries between life and death were entirely subject to his subtle command. The kingdom had learned a harsh truth. To underestimate the boy who spoke only to the dead was to risk vanishing into legend itself. The silent heir's ascension to power was a moment both anticipated and feared, a culmination of years of whispered legend, uncanny events, and the growing influence of a boy who spoke only to the dead. When the king fell gravely ill, the court was thrown into a frenzy of speculation. Advisors debated succession, nobles measured their allegiance, and foreign emissaries prepared to exploit any perceived weakness. Yet amidst this turmoil, the prince remained calm, a figure of quiet authority whose gaze alone seemed to steady the anxious pulse of the palace. His coronation, when it came, was unlike any in the kingdom's history. The ceremony followed all formal protocols, yet there was an unmistakable tension in the air, a sense that unseen eyes, both living and spectral, were present to witness the transition. Priests whispered prayers not only for the new king's health and wisdom, but also for protection from forces they did not fully understand. Courtiers observed the young heir with a mixture of reverence and terror, careful in every gesture, knowing that his silence did not imply ignorance, but the quiet comprehension of every unspoken secret, every hidden ambition. The kingdom itself seemed to acknowledge his unique authority. Decisions, once debated heatedly among advisors, were now tempered by the implicit understanding that the king's perception transcended the ordinary. Disputes were settled with a glance, negotiations guided by subtle suggestion rather than overt command. The prince's reputation as a mediator between the living and the dead infused the monarchy with an air of otherworldly control. His counsel was sought not only for political matters, but for matters that defied explanation. Illness, omens, and events that seemed to carry the fingerprints of the supernatural. His reign began with careful observation, a period in which the silent heir assessed both allies and rivals, testing loyalty, probing weaknesses, and gathering knowledge as one might collect maps of unseen terrain. He rarely spoke, yet when he did, his words carried an authority so absolute that courtiers deferred without question. Messages from the dead, he seemed to suggest, were as binding as laws from the living, and those who ignored them risked consequences both immediate and enduring. The court, once a place of intrigue and open maneuvering, became a theater of caution and meticulous calculation. Foreign powers took note, sensing the unusual power wielded by a ruler who moved with quiet omniscience. Envoys reported in letters that the young king's presence was unsettling, that his silence could reveal intentions before they were spoken aloud. Treaties were approached with heightened care, for the silent heir's counsel was reputed to include insights that no living diplomat could provide. Fear and respect became inseparable in dealings with him, reinforcing the perception that his monarchy was not merely a political institution, but a nexus where the ordinary and the spectral converged. The king's ability to navigate the kingdom's complex web of alliances and rivalries owed much to the lessons learned in his youth. The night of the shattered seal, the vanishing of the courtier, and the whispers of betrayal had all forged a ruler whose perception extended beyond the visible, whose decisions were informed by knowledge inaccessible to the mortal mind. Even in moments of crisis, the silent heir exhibited a calm and methodical approach, often revealing truths hidden from his advisors and foreseeing consequences that seemed almost preternatural. Yet the ascension was not without cost. The young king remained distant, emotionally removed from most courtiers and advisors, an aloof figure whose inner life belonged as much to the spirits he communed with as to the kingdom he now ruled. Rumors persisted that he would consult the dead before making judgments on matters of state, that his decisions were guided by conversations imperceptible to others. Though fear tempered dissent, it also sowed isolation. Those closest to him understood that the silent heir's authority was absolute, and that his dominion extended into realms where no one dared follow. Over time, the kingdom adapted to its new ruler. Policies and alliances were shaped by the implicit knowledge that the king's perception encompassed both the living and the departed. Festivals, courts, and ceremonies carried an air of solemnity, a recognition that this was a monarchy unlike any other, one where the past spoke to the present, where justice could be exacted by silence, and where the unseen watched as intently as the visible. The silent heir's reign, marked by subtlety and fear, became a legend even during his lifetime, a reign remembered as much for the aura of the supernatural as for any political or military achievement. Ultimately, the ascension of the silent heir was more than the crowning of a monarch. It was the establishment of a kingdom governed under the gaze of one who straddled the boundary between life and death. It was a realm in which silence was law, perception was power, and the whispers of the dead were as vital as the counsel of the living. The boy who had once refused to speak had become a king whose authority was absolute, a ruler whose presence ensured that history, memory, and the spectral realm were intertwined in the fate of the kingdom. The kingdom learned, in awe and in fear, that the silent heir was no ordinary monarch. He was a living testament to the delicate balance between the mortal and the supernatural, a king whose reign would forever blur the lines between legend and reality, life and death, silence and command. His story, once whispered in secret chambers, now echoed through every corridor, every village, and every heart in the realm. A reminder that the boy who spoke only to the dead had become the king who ruled over the living. The legacy of silence extends beyond the reign of the silent heir, stretching into the collective memory of the kingdom and the folklore of generations that followed. Though he ruled with unparalleled authority, his reign was marked less by battles won or laws enacted than by the pervasive sense that the boundary between the living and the dead had been irrevocably altered. The whispers that once filled the nursery, the corridors of the court, and the shadowed corners of the palace became a permanent element of the kingdom's consciousness, a reminder that the prince, now king, had changed the very nature of power and perception. Stories of the silent heir persisted long after his death. Minstrels and chroniclers recorded accounts of his uncanny knowledge, the disasters he seemed to avert or foretell, and the unexplainable events that had become commonplace during his reign. Families told tales of ancestors who had benefited or suffered by his decisions, often attributing fortunes and misfortunes to his unseen guidance. Villagers whispered that even after the king's passing, his presence lingered, that in quiet moments, one might glimpse a shadow at the edge of vision or hear a faint murmur that seemed to issue from nowhere. The kingdom itself became a living testament to his influence, a place where silence carried weight and the unseen commanded respect. The legacy extended into the very fabric of governance and society. Advisors and courtiers who had survived his reign carried his lessons into the next generation. Trust was measured cautiously, decisions weighed with careful consideration of unseen consequences, and loyalty was understood to be a currency more vital than gold. The young heirs who followed were educated not merely in diplomacy or strategy, but in the delicate art of perception, taught to respect forces beyond comprehension. Schools of thought emerged that blended superstition, observation, and political calculation, all inspired by the silent heir's methods and his uncanny understanding of the interplay between life and death. Folklore and superstition intertwined with history, creating a mythology in which the silent heir became both ruler and legend. Children were told stories of the boy who spoke to the dead, of the courtier who vanished, and of the ominous events that accompanied his presence. These tales were cautionary, blending admiration and fear. To be cunning, to lie, or to ignore the unseen was to risk misfortune or disappearance. The boundaries between historical record and folklore blurred, and in that liminal space, the silent heir's life became timeless, a story retold with reverence and dread. Even the kingdom's physical spaces bore witness to his reign. Palaces and towers, long associated with grandeur and authority, were now remembered for the whispers that echoed through empty halls, the flicker of lights in abandoned rooms, and the sense that some eyes always watched. It was said that in chambers where he once walked, the air retained a subtle chill, as if the presence of the dead he communed with had left an imprint upon the stones themselves. Visitors to these places often reported unease, a creeping sense that the silent heir's influence persisted, tangible yet impossible to grasp. The moral and psychological imprint of his life was profound. The silent heir had demonstrated that power was not only derived from force or wealth, but from knowledge, perception, and the ability to navigate unseen currents. He showed that silence could command obedience, that whispers could shape destinies, and that the past, present, and unseen realms were intertwined in ways that demanded respect. Generations of leaders and citizens alike internalized these lessons, consciously or unconsciously adjusting their behavior in response to the enduring legend of the boy who spoke only to the dead. In the broader cultural memory, the silent heir became a symbol of the uncanny, a reminder of the thin veil separating the living from the dead, the natural from the supernatural. Artists, writers, and storytellers drew inspiration from his life, portraying him as a figure both heroic and terrifying, a king who commanded spirits, foresaw disasters, and enforced justice without uttering a word. His story transcended mere biography, becoming a lens through which the kingdom explored questions of morality, fate, and the unseen forces that shape human experience. Ultimately, the legacy of silence is a testament to the enduring power of presence and perception. The silent heir's life illustrated that authority could be wielded through quiet observation, and that the line between legend and reality could be as fragile as the hush of a palace corridor. His reign and the stories that followed ensured that the kingdom would never forget the boy who spoke only to the dead, whose silence commanded respect, fear, and awe. Centuries later, scholars and storytellers continue to debate the truth behind his legend. Was he truly a conduit to the dead, or a child whose extraordinary perception was mistaken for the supernatural? Did the vanishings, curses, and uncanny knowledge truly occur, or were they embellishments of fear and folklore? These questions persist precisely because the prince's life was shrouded in mystery, layered in shadows, and intertwined with forces beyond ordinary understanding. The legacy of silence, therefore, is not merely historical. It is eternal, a haunting reminder that some lives and some silences leave an imprint on the world that cannot be erased. In the end, the silent heir stands as a figure who defies conventional storytelling, a ruler, a legend, a boy, and a conduit, whose presence reshaped a kingdom and whose story continues to resonate. His life reminds us that the line between life and death, silence and speech, the ordinary and the supernatural, is thinner than we dare to imagine, and that sometimes the most powerful forces in the world are those we cannot see, hear, or fully understand. Echoes Beyond the Throne serves as the final reflection on the life and legend of the silent heir, examining how his presence continued to influence not only the kingdom, but the very imagination of those who followed. Long after his passing, scholars, storytellers, and even ordinary villagers reported glimpses of phenomena associated with him. Fleeting shadows at dusk, inexplicable murmurs in empty halls, or sudden chills in rooms where he once walked. These echoes were interpreted as the lasting influence of a ruler whose silence had been more commanding than any decree, whose awareness had penetrated realms beyond the living. The cultural and spiritual imprint of the silent heir was profound. In libraries and monasteries, manuscripts contained marginal notes and codices inspired by his reign, documenting omens, predictions, and the supernatural events that surrounded him. Some chroniclers insisted these texts were divinely guided, others that they were infused with the subtle fear and awe that the silent heir instilled in his court. Regardless of origin, these writings became foundational in shaping how subsequent generations perceived the intertwining of mortality and the afterlife, the natural and the spectral. Beyond historical records, the silent heir's legend took on symbolic weight. He became a cautionary archetype in moral and philosophical discourse. The boy who defied ordinary understanding, whose silence wielded authority over the living and unseen alike. Moralists debated whether his connection to the dead was a divine gift or a curse, while philosophers speculated on the boundaries of perception, knowledge, and the unseen. The silent heir was no longer just a historical figure. He had become a lens through which people examined the limits of human understanding and the fragile threshold between life and death. Folklore expanded the reach of his story, turning it into a living tradition. Parents told children of the boy in the tower who could commune with spirits, weaving lessons of caution, reverence, and respect for forces beyond comprehension. Minstrels and bards immortalized the silent heir in ballads, emphasizing both the awe-inspiring and terrifying aspects of his life. The vanished courtier, the whispers in the corridors, the silent judgments, and the uncanny foresight that seemed to dictate the kingdom's fate. These tales blurred the line between history and myth, ensuring that the boy who spoke only to the dead remained alive in collective memory long after mortal life had ended. Even architecture bore witness to his presence. Palaces, towers, and chambers where he had walked were said to retain traces of his influence. Flickering shadows, sudden gusts of cold air, or the sensation of being observed by unseen eyes. Travelers and historians visiting these sites reported an eerie awareness, a sense that the silent heir's authority lingered beyond time and corporeal existence. The kingdom itself became a landscape imbued with his aura, a place where silence and observation continued to hold power long after his reign concluded. Politically, his legacy reshaped governance and strategy for generations. Rulers and advisors internalized the lessons of vigilance, perception, and caution, understanding that power could reside not only in force or wealth, but in knowledge, patience, and awareness of unseen currents. The silent heir demonstrated that influence could extend beyond speech, that authority could be exerted through presence, and that fear and respect were often more potent than commands or laws. These insights were carried forward, subtly shaping the nature of monarchy and administration in the kingdom for decades to come. The philosophical and psychological dimensions of his life remain a source of fascination. Scholars debated whether his extraordinary perception was innate, supernatural, or the product of intense observation and intellect. The line between genius and the uncanny blurred, leaving room for speculation, myth, and interpretation. His life encouraged contemplation of human limits, the power of silence, and the potential for the unseen to guide the visible world. His legend became a mirror, reflecting both fear and aspiration, mortality and the infinite unknown. Ultimately, echoes beyond the throne cement the silent heir's place as a figure whose impact transcended time. He was a monarch, a child, a conduit, and a legend. His silence became a language, his presence a law, and his story a bridge between the living and the dead. The kingdom learned that the weight of perception and the subtle authority of observation could surpass the power of words or weapons, that some truths lie in quiet understanding, and that some lives leave echoes impossible to erase. Even centuries later, his tale endures. Historians, storytellers, and even skeptics continue to revisit the silent heir, questioning the balance of myth and reality, the nature of his abilities, and the extent of his influence. His life challenges assumptions about authority, perception, and mortality, reminding us that the most profound forces are often invisible, unspoken, and eternal. In every whispered tale, in every shadowed corridor, and in every cautious glance toward the unknown, the silent heir's legacy persists, a haunting testament to the boy who spoke only to the dead, whose silence reshaped a kingdom, and whose story refuses to fade. The final chapter of his legend is not a conclusion, but an invitation to ponder what lies beyond the veil, to recognize the subtle forces that shape history and perception, and to understand that the boundary between life and death is thinner, more permeable, and infinitely more mysterious than we ever imagined. The silent heir's echoes continue, reverberating through time, reminding us that sometimes the most powerful presences are those we cannot see, cannot hear, yet cannot ignore.